It is the 4th of June, 1944. Somewhere in the Corrèze département of south-central France, a man in a farmer's coat is crouching in the damp darkness beside a railway embankment. He is not a soldier. He is not a spy in any cinematic sense. He is, by trade, a schoolteacher. His hands are shaking, not from the cold, but from the knowledge of what he is holding. In his right fist, between his thumb and forefinger, is a thin metal tube, roughly the length and width of a carpenter's pencil. It weighs less than 20 grams. It looks to any German patrol that might happen upon him in the next 30 seconds like almost nothing at all. He presses the tube against the flat of his thumb, feels the slight give as the glass inside crushes, and then, carefully, with the precision of a man who has rehearsed this 100 times on a kitchen table far from here, he slots it into the plastic explosive he has already shaped and pressed against the underside of the rail. He does not wait. He stands, tucks his hands into his pockets, and walks back through the trees toward the village. He will be home before midnight. He will be in his classroom by 8 o'clock the following morning. 2 hours later, a German troop train carrying reinforcements toward the Normandy coast derails in the dark. The locomotive tips sideways into the embankment. The track is twisted beyond immediate repair. The men aboard are delayed by more than 30 hours during which the Allied beachhead consolidates, digs in, and survives. The schoolteacher hears the distant crump of the detonation from his bedroom. He does not get up. The device he used that night was called, officially, the Switch Number 10 delay. To the men and women who handled it, the agents dropped into occupied France, the resistance fighters, the commandos, it was simply the time pencil. And for nearly 5 decades after the war ended, most of the world had never heard of it. The facility that created it did not appear in histories. The chemists who designed it were not decorated in public. The 12 million of them that rolled off the production line in a quiet corner of Hertfordshire were never mentioned in official communiques. The time pencil was, in every meaningful sense, a secret buried in the ground. This is its story. To understand why a device so small could matter so much, you have to understand the position Britain found itself in during the summer of 1940. By June of that year, France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had been extracted from the beaches of Dunkirk in a state of near-total material collapse, leaving behind tens of thousands of vehicles, guns, and tons of munitions. The Wehrmacht stood on the French coast and looked across 21 miles of water. German bombers were already attacking British harbors and cities. The consensus among military planners on both sides of the Channel was that invasion was not merely possible. It was probable. Britain was militarily exhausted and, in the bluntest terms, outgunned. Churchill understood something that traditional military doctrine did not account for. Conventional warfare, the kind fought with infantry divisions and artillery batteries and air superiority, was not going to be enough. Even if the invasion was somehow repelled, the continent was now occupied territory. France, Belgium, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands. All of it was under German control, and the German war machine depended on the infrastructure of those occupied countries. The railways, the bridges, the power stations, the fuel depots, the communication lines. If that infrastructure could be disrupted, not by bomber squadrons, which were expensive and imprecise and attracted enormous defensive response, but by individuals, small groups, people who were already there, then the cost to Germany of holding Europe could be made intolerable. In July 1940, Churchill authorized the creation of the Special Operations Executive. His instruction to its first director, Hugh Dalton, was characteristically blunt. Set Europe ablaze. The SOE's mission was sabotage on an industrial scale, carried out by agents operating undercover in occupied territory and by resistance networks already forming in the shadows across the continent. And to carry out sabotage of any sophistication, you needed a reliable way to make things explode at a time and place of your choosing, without being anywhere near them when they did. The standard military approach to demolitions at the time was the burning safety fuse, a length of cord that burned at a predictable rate, typically about 30 seconds per 30 centimeters, and ignited a detonator at the end of its run. It was reliable enough for combat engineers working with infantry support, who could light the fuse and withdraw under cover of their own troops. For a lone resistance fighter in occupied France, it was almost useless. You needed to be within earshot of the blast. You needed to be there, visibly, at the moment of detonation, or close enough to it that a German patrol finding a burned fuse end could calculate, with reasonable accuracy, when and where you had been standing. In a world where a single loose thread of suspicion could unravel an entire resistance network, that was not an acceptable risk. What the SOE needed was a delay mechanism, a fuse that an operative could set and then leave, hours before the explosion, giving them time to establish an alibi, to be elsewhere, to be anyone at all. The challenge was not conceptual. The challenge was chemistry and engineering, and specifically the challenge of making a delay mechanism small enough to be hidden on a person, simple enough to be operated by someone with no scientific training, reliable enough to function in the mud and cold of a French winter, and robust enough to survive being dropped from an aircraft in a supply canister at 200 miles per hour. That was what the scientists at Aston House were given 2 years to solve. Aston House stood in the village of Aston, near Stevenage in Hertfordshire, a handsome 17th-century manor house set in Parkland that, before the war, had been the quiet home of a gentleman farmer. In 1940, the War Office requisitioned it. It became Station 12 of the Special Operations Executive, and what happened inside its walls, and in the outbuildings, the barns, and the carefully isolated testing ranges beyond, was classified at the highest possible level for the duration of the war and for many years afterward. The men and women who worked there signed the Official Secrets Act and, in the main, kept its provisions. It was not until the publication of researcher Des Turner's detailed history of the site, following decades of patient archival work, that the full scope of what Station 12 produced became properly known to the public. The time pencil's origins predated Aston House. The initial number 10 variant had been developed in 1939 by Section D, a precursor to the SOE focused on irregular warfare, drawing on earlier designs that traced back to adaptations of German chemical fuse mechanisms used in the First World War. But it was at Station 12, under the supervision of Commander Millis Jeffress and his team of chemists and engineers, that the device was refined, tested, and brought to the extraordinary production volumes that made it genuinely useful as a weapon of mass sabotage. The mechanism was, at its heart, both elegant and brutal. The finished device measured just 127 millimeters in length and 8 millimeters in diameter, barely the width of a finger. It weighed 18.5 grams, roughly equivalent to a 50-pence coin. Inside a sealed metal tube, a glass ampule contained a solution of cupric chloride, a corrosive chemical compound. Running alongside it, a thin wire of precisely calibrated steel held back a small but forceful spring under considerable tension. That spring, when released, would drive a striker pin into a percussion cap, which would in turn ignite whatever explosive or detonating cord the pencil had been connected to. The critical intelligence was in that wire. The cupric chloride, when the glass ampule was crushed, which the operative accomplished simply by pinching the tube firmly between thumb and forefinger, began to eat through the restraining wire. As the wire corroded, it thinned. When it became thin enough, it snapped, and the spring was released. The interval between the crushing of the ampule and the snapping of the wire was the delay. The time pencil's entire tactical value expressed in chemistry and metallurgy. The delay was controlled by the thickness of the wire and, crucially, by temperature. Warmer conditions accelerated the corrosion. Colder conditions slowed it. This meant that the same pencil might detonate after 2 hours on a warm September afternoon, but after 6 hours on a January night in the Ardennes. Station 12 developed a color-coded system to account for this. A pencil with a red collar was rated at a 10-minute delay at room temperature, white for 30 minutes, blue for several hours, black for a day or longer. Agents were trained to apply corrections based on the ambient temperature. It was not a perfect system, but it was, under the circumstances, an extraordinary achievement. The manufacturing process at Aston House was continuous and operated under strict secrecy. Components were machined at the facility and in contracted workshops across Hertfordshire. The glass ampoules were produced by specialist firms who, in many cases, were never told what the component was for. Assembly required care. The spring tension was substantial, and a carelessly handled pencil could detonate the charge it was connected to with no delay at all. Workers wore protective equipment. Accidents occurred. The work continued. By the end of the war, Station 12 had produced over 12 million time pencil fuses. A figure that, when you hold the device in your imagination and consider the scale of the conflict it was helping to wage, is almost incomprehensible. The time pencil reached France by several routes. SOE agents, trained at one of the organization's many requisitioned country houses across Britain, were flown into occupied territory by the RAF's Special Duties Squadrons, based primarily at Tempsford in Bedfordshire. They carried pencils in hollowed belt buckles, sewn into jacket linings, concealed inside cigarette cases. Supply drops by Lysander aircraft and later by Halifax and Sterling bombers delivered canisters packed with plastic explosive, initially an SOE development, itself a product of the Hertfordshire Research Network, and the fuses to activate them. The resistance received them, buried them in fields, hid them in barns, taped them inside hollow fence posts, and waited. The operational use of the time pencil across occupied France forms a catalogue of precise, untraceable destruction that is only now, with the gradual declassification of SOE records and the memoirs of surviving resistance, beginning to be properly documented. Railway infrastructure was the primary target. A single pencil, a sliver of plastic explosive the size of a man's fist, and 20 minutes of darkness were sufficient to cut a rail line, derail a locomotive, or disable a points signal box. Because the operative was never present at the moment of detonation, establishing culpability was extraordinarily difficult for German security forces. A burnt fuse leaves a trail. A chemical mechanism buried beneath a railway sleeper leaves nothing. The réseau known as Stockbroker, operating in the Loire Valley, is estimated to have cut the main Paris-Bordeaux line more than 30 times between 1943 and the Liberation. The ventriloquist network in the Sologne region disrupted German troop movements so systematically in the weeks before and after D-Day that a later German military assessment described the area as effectively impassable for motorized transport at night. The wheelwright circuit in Gascony, under the remarkable agent George Reginald Starr, coordinated attacks on railway junctions across a region the size of Wales. In each case, the time pencil was the enabling technology, the thing that made it possible for a farmer, a baker, a postmistress to become, briefly and invisibly, an instrument of strategic disruption. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The psychological impact on German railway administration was, by some accounts, as significant as the physical damage. German engineers could repair a cut rail line within hours. What they could not easily defend against was the knowledge that any length of track at any time might be carrying a dormant fuse set to activate without warning. The Reichsbahn, German state railways, was compelled to deploy increasing numbers of troops on guard duties along thousands of kilometers of French railway, troops who might otherwise have been available for combat operations. In Normandy, in the weeks following the Allied landings, German armored formations that should have reached the front within 24 hours took 3, 4, 5 days, losing the critical advantage of speed that mechanized warfare demanded. The German approach to sabotage delay mechanisms was, in several respects, instructive by comparison. The Wehrmacht and the Abwehr had developed their own range of chemical and mechanical fuse systems, many of them sophisticated and some of them predating the British variants. The Zündschnur, the standard burning fuse, was widely used. Mechanical clockwork delay fuses were produced in quantity. However, German sabotage doctrine prioritized the direct action of uniformed combat engineers over the distributed irregular model that SOE and the French resistance had perfected. German delay mechanisms were generally larger, heavier, and less easily concealed, designed for use by trained soldiers operating in the field rather than by civilians operating under occupation. The Americans, arriving late to the irregular warfare picture through the Office of Strategic Services, initially relied on British designs and British production entirely. The OSS received time pencils manufactured at Aston House and used them in operations across France, Italy, and the Pacific Theater. American research into chemical delay fuses accelerated from 1942 onward, and the U.S. eventually developed its own variants, some of which improved on the color coding system and addressed the temperature sensitivity problem with greater precision. But American after-action assessments consistently noted that the British device had been first, had been produced in the greatest numbers, and had established the operational doctrine that American irregular warfare units then adapted. The concept was entirely British, born in a Hertfordshire manor house, refined in conditions of total secrecy, and distributed to people who had never heard of Stevenage and never would. Other resistance movements received time pencils manufactured at Aston House. Norwegian agents used them against the German heavy water production facility at Vemork, part of the operation that set back Nazi atomic research by an uncertain but potentially decisive margin. Yugoslav partisans received them in supply drops. Polish Home Army operatives used them in the infrastructure sabotage campaign that preceded and accompanied the Warsaw Uprising. The device was, in its quiet way, a common thread running through Allied irregular warfare on every front where Britain had a hand. The question of the time pencil's actual impact on the outcome of the war is one that historians approach with appropriate caution. Sabotage campaigns are notoriously difficult to assess in material terms. A derailed train can be replaced. A cut rail can be repaired. The counterfactual, what German operations would have looked like without the constant attrition of railway disruption, without the manpower tied down in guard duties, without the delays imposed on reinforcement columns in Normandy, is not something that can be quantified with confidence. What can be said is that General Dwight Eisenhower, in a letter written in May 1945, stated that the disruption of enemy rail communications and the harassing of German road movements by organized resistance forces had played a very considerable part in the complete and final Allied victory. That is not a throwaway compliment. Eisenhower was not a man given to exaggeration in official correspondence. The time pencil survived the war in unexpected ways. The principle of the chemical delay fuse became a staple of military demolition doctrine, influencing the design of fusing systems used in conflicts well beyond the Second World War. The color-coded collar system, developed at Aston House to account for temperature variation, became an industry standard. The broader SOE approach, distributing purpose-built, easily concealable, operationally simple devices to untrained resistance fighters, established a template for irregular warfare logistics that shaped British and American special operations thinking for decades. The Aston House facility itself did not survive. The house was demolished in 1961 by the Stevenage Newtown Development Corporation, the parkland converted into what is now a golf course. Somewhere beneath the fairways, as the researcher Des Turner noted with characteristic dry wit, it is entirely possible that unexploded ordnance from wartime testing still lies in the earth. Players at the Stevenage Golf and Conference Center are presumably unaware of this. The building is gone, but its legacy is buried in the ground beneath their feet. Surviving time pencils can be found in collections at the Imperial War Museum in London, where they are displayed in the Second World War galleries, and at a number of specialist military museums across Britain. They look remarkably unremarkable. Thin metal cylinders, slightly corroded, with the colored collars faded to something barely distinguishable from rust. You would not look at one twice in an antique shop. That was, of course, precisely the point. Return now to that railway embankment in the Corrèze. Return to the schoolteacher walking back through the trees, hands in his pockets, the faint smell of the plastic explosive still on his fingers. He does not think of himself as an engineer or a chemist or a military strategist. He thinks of himself as a man who was handed something and told what to do with it, by other men who had in turn been handed something by scientists in a country house in Hertfordshire, who were themselves working within constraints they had been given by planners, who were themselves working within the parameters of a war that was rewriting the rules of what was possible. The chain of causation that runs from a Stevenage laboratory to a French railway embankment is, when you follow it, one of the most remarkable administrative and scientific achievements of the entire war. A problem was identified. How do you make untrained civilians into effective saboteurs without getting them killed in the act? And the answer was engineered, manufactured 12 million times over, parachuted into occupied territory in sealed canisters, and distributed hand-to-hand through networks that existed entirely in whispers and dead drops and chalk marks on shuttered shop fronts. The time pencil did not win the war. No single device does. But it contributed to a disruption of German logistics that was systematic, sustained, and strategically consequential. It gave ordinary people, schoolteachers, farmers, bakers, postmistresses, students, shopkeepers, the means to participate in the defense of their own occupied country without sacrificing themselves in the act. It made sabotage democratic, if such a phrase is not too strange to apply to the business of blowing up railway lines, and it remained secret, largely for 50 years. The men who built it went back to their ordinary lives. The women who assembled it in the outbuildings of a Hertfordshire manor house returned to their families. The agents who carried it into occupied France, those who survived, were sworn to silence, and most of them kept that silence until the silence no longer mattered. The resistance who used it buried their memories as they had buried the devices, in the dark, in the ground, below the surface of things that looked entirely ordinary. A glass ampule, a thin wire, a coiled spring, 18.5 grams, and a train that never reached Normandy.